Starting off with the introduction. It is important to note that a good essay doesn't go straight into addressing or answering the question, as we must first develop our essays properly so that the essay as a whole will bear some sense of coherence. Because the chapter in question concerns the third unit of the AS Law syllabus, i.e., legal personnel, we should therefore briefly define and explain legal personnel and lay personnel such as magistrates and juries in the legal system. This is where we will be briefly introducing what and who legal personnel are, especially lay people within the system, since they are the core focus of the question that needs to be addressed in the essay answer. Since the question concerns magistrates, we should then direct the introduction to the magistracy and the magistrates' courts. From here, we can connect our discussion to the core focus of the question, i.e., selection and training of lay magistrates. Now that we are done with the brief introduction of lay personnel as well as the magistracy, we should then endeavor to state our objective for the essay. The objective comes in the form of a thesis statement which must address the question, or at least the focus of the question. It is good to have a thesis statement, as this will give the examiner a clear insight of where we are going with our essay, and also to keep us from digressing in our discussion and to ensure that we remain close to what the question is asking us to focus on. With this in mind, we will briefly explain that before we can delve into the topic of selection and training of lay magistrates, we will briefly discuss the magistracy and their general purpose in the legal system. We will then discuss the selection as well as the training of lay magistrates before giving a critical evaluation as to whether the process of selection and training received is adequate or not. Point 1 of the essay should always be treated as a bridging point between the introduction and the core of the essay, which actually critically addresses the question. This is the part where we can briefly introduce the background of the magistracy as well as its purpose in the legal system. And a special note to its layness should also be emphasized here, since the question is, after all, about lay magistrates, which we can very briefly compare to legally qualified personnel such as judges. However, as noted in the marking scheme, the general discussion on the magistracy should only be a passing note and not too much time and effort is spent here. What we could possibly do is to stress more on the role of the magistracy in both civil and criminal cases that they have to deal with in the magistrates' courts, where most cases start from, since it is the most common court of first instance. However, again, it should only be a passing note, or that we can also opt to leave out the magistrate's specific role altogether and move on to addressing the focus of the question, i.e., selection and training. After a clear explanation on the magistracy that will give the rest of the answer a better context in relation to the question, we can now move on to the core of the answer. In point 2, we will be delving into the detailed discussion of selection and training of lay magistrates. Here, we can separate the discussion of selection and training into 2 or more than 2 paragraphs, depending on the length of the content on each topic of discussion. It is crucial that we start off by discussing the basic qualification requirement that a person must have before any consideration of magistracy. Lay magistrates generally do not have to have any legal qualifications, but they must be suitable in character, integrity, and understanding for the work they have to perform as a lay magistrate. This can come under a more elaborated concept of judicial qualities that is required of potential magistrates. Other than that, this qualification would be a good point to include so as to balance the discussion on selection, which helps to address the issue of adequacy. For example, serious criminal convictions, bankrupt, members of the armed forces, relatives of those working in the local criminal justice system, etc. Next is the actual selection and appointment of magistracy. And here, the role of the local advisory committees as well as the senior presiding judge must be discussed, which is followed by the interview process. The two key aspects of the interview process is, firstly, the interview itself, which seeks to determine the candidate's personal attributes and whether they match the key qualities required, and secondly, the candidate's potential judicial aptitude, which is tested by discussion of various types of case studies. After the detailed discussion of the selection process, we will now endeavour to consider the actual training process of the magistracy. The Magistrates Committee of the Judicial Studies Board must be highlighted as it is responsible for supervising and regulating the training of magistrates, while the Magisterial Committee of the Judicial College draws up the syllabus of the topics which lay magistrates should cover in their training. Key trainings which cover self-management, teamwork, making and managing judicial decisions should be highlighted and discussed briefly. In between all the actual training, the role of mentorship and the appraisal that comes after a period of practical training should be discussed as well. Once we are done laying down all the necessary points regarding the selection and training of lay magistrates, then we can move on to consider if all these aspects of the magistracy is adequate. Point 3 is where the evaluative part of the essay should be. It is crucial that in any essays that ask us to draw comparisons, discuss the advantages and disadvantages, assess its adequacy, etc., we must make sure that we leave enough space in our answer to critically discuss the evaluative aspect of the essay. If we were to leave out this part, or that we only leave it as a passing note, then we will lose out a lot of marks that can afford our essay answer a high band mark. Therefore, in this part of the essay, we should revisit some of the key points that we have discussed in point 2 regarding the selection and training of lay magistrates in relation to its adequacy. If we didn't mention much about its adequacy and focus solely on the factual aspect of the selection and training in point 2, then this is where we should critically evaluate some of the more important aspects of selection and training individually, while highlighting some of the points to justify its adequacy with our own reasonings. One key highlight to the selection process is the balance between qualification and disqualification, and how the local advisory committees can weigh in on the selection of potential candidates in a way which proves the justification for its adequacy in the selection process. This point can also be discussed in relation to the training itself, i.e., whether or not the amount of training is adequate, and your thoughts about some of the criticisms against the training process. Perhaps the issue with mentorship is something that you can highlight while evaluating the training process, and how mentorship is something which proves to have positive effect on potential magistrates, because they do not just learn about the role of a magistrate, but also get to shadow an actual magistrate and get some practical training along the way. As always, a simple conclusion will do. We should definitely not insert any more new points into our conclusion, otherwise it wouldn't be a conclusion. Just briefly summarize what has been discussed in the content of the essay and highlight some of the more important points of the essay that may address the question. A conclusion for this particular question should highlight some of the key aspects of the discussion, such as why the selection and training process of lay magistrates is adequate or inadequate, together with the writer's final word on the discussion above.